Hi fellow Django developers, Hezekiah here from alwaysdjango.com, where we discuss interesting Django topics that helps you grow, improve as a Django developer. If that sounds interesting, like, subscribe, share this video with anyone you feel will find this video important. Let's get into it. So today we'll be looking at Django generic views permission. That's permission in Django generic views. In the last tutorial, we looked at authentication, right? In the last tutorial in our Django generic views playlist, we looked at authentication, right? So what's the difference between authentication and permission? Now, authentication makes sure that a user, for instance, that has an account in our application makes use of an endpoint or a resource in our application, right? While permission makes sure a user with enough or required credentials makes use of an endpoint, right? What I'm trying to say maybe graphically is maybe we have this endpoint, we have this resource in our application, right? This is the resource in our application, and we have maybe a user, please don't mind my drawing, a user right here, right, that wants to make use of this part of our application. Then we have this gateway here, right? This is our authentication gateway. Now if they want to make use of this application, they have to go through this gateway and they have to come with a slip, right? Let's say authentication slip, right? So when they come to this gateway, we check if they have this authentication slip. If they are with it, they come into this endpoint right here, right? So they are authenticated to use this endpoint. Now permission means maybe in this endpoint there is another part of this endpoint, right? A supercharged part of this endpoint, the part of this endpoint that has more abilities than the normal parts, right? So they are still with the authentication slip, right? So permission means when they want to access this endpoint here, their slip must have some sort of credentials, right? For instance, their slip must have a stamp. For instance, without that stamp, they cannot make use of this part of our application, right? So authentication makes sure that they are with their slip, while permission makes sure that their slip has a particular type of property, right? Maybe it has the stamp, or maybe it is signed or something like that, right? So that is the difference between authentication and permission. You can say like permission is a secondary part of authentication, right? You have to authenticate before you permit, right? So going back to our code right here, this is where we added authentication to a generic view, right? We imported this login required mixing and we added it here, and we said with this endpoint, this generic view endpoint has been secured, right? Only authenticated users can use this endpoint. Now here we want to implement permissions, right? So we want to maybe make sure that any user that uses this endpoint is a super user, right? In Django, there is a concept of super users. Super users are like type of users that has admin permissions, right? That can maybe edit the Django admin panel, if you know about that, right? So first of all, we import to add permissions in generic views. We use the user passes test mixing. That's user passes test mixing, right? So with this mixing, you can implement with this mixing. You have to have the login required, then the user passes test mixing, because without logging in a user, there is no user that you are passing the test for, right? So in this class we inherit from this mixing. So the login required mixing, then the user passes text mixing. Now to use this user passes text mixing, how do we like check if a user has a sort of credential? Now to check that, there is a function when you inherit from user passes text mixing. There is a function that you can override. The name of that function is test func, right? Test func, right? So this text func returns a boolean, right? That's yes or true or false, right? So when it's true, the user passes. When it's false, the permission fails, right? So what do we want to do? We want to make sure that the user is a super user. And if you know about super users in Django, admin users in Django, they have a credential called is super, right? So without that super credential being true, that user is not a super user. So what we are going to do here is simply we say we return self.request.user.is super, right? So if the user is a super user, this is super credential would be true, right? If the user is not a super user, is not an admin user, the user will be false. That's this will return false right here. If this is super is not true, it will return false. The permission will fail. If it's true, it returns true. The permission will pass, right? So if we let me check if so our server is on. Our server is on right here. So if we go back to this endpoint, if we go to our urls.py, we have this endpoint here, this generic view endpoint, which is the endpoint that makes use of this view class right here, that makes use of this generic class right here. So if we go back and say generic view, let's remove this backslash here. So if we go back and say generic view, so it says user does not have, sorry guys, user.isAdmin, sorry, user.isAdmin or is user.isSuperUser, right? So the property is not user.isSuper, the property is user.isSuperUser. So if we go back and reload again, you can see that we can use this endpoint, right? So we can use this endpoint because we are authenticated, right? We are authenticated right here and we are logged in as a super user. But if we should log out, right, and go back to generic view endpoint, go back to this endpoint, we'll be asked to log in. If we log in again, admin, so if we log in again, our username is admin. If you watch the last tutorial, our username is admin. You know that we created a super user with username admin and password admin. So if we log in, we are logged in right now. Obviously we can access, let's copy this. Obviously because we are logged in, we can access generic view, this endpoint right here, right? So we are logged in and we are a super user. So let's say how do we make this user not to be super, right? So if we go to our terminal, if you know about Python shell, let me open my command line here. So if you know about Django Python shell, so you can open it by python manage.py shell, right? I just want to make the user, I just want to get this user. After getting this user, I make it, I set this is super user, this is super user field here, I set it to false, right? So from django.contrib.auth, we import the get user model, right? This will get us the user model. So if we say model, or let's say m is equal to get user model. So if we say m is equal to get user model, this is the user model now. So what do we want to do? We want to get the user from this model. Say m is equal to m.object.get username is equal to admin, right? Admin, right? So this is the user right here. We have gotten the user. So what do we want to do? We want to say user dot is super user is equal to false, right? So we have made this user not to be super. So we say user dot save, right? So after doing this, what do we expect? We expect this right now to return false, right? So if it returns false, we don't want to access this endpoint because the user is not super user. That means he's not permitted to use this endpoint. Yes, he's authenticated, right? So if we go back and reload again, you can see he's still authenticated, but you can see you don't have permission to view or edit anything. You can see he's still authenticated. You can still log out right here, but he's not permitted. So if we go back and reload here, you can see 404 forbidden, 403 forbidden, right? He's forbidden to use this endpoint. If we should go back again and say user.isSuperUser, let's set it to true, right? And save. So if we save again, he's now a super user. This will return true right now. If we go back and reload again, you can see you are able to access this endpoint. So that's it for me, guys. That's it for me today. This is how you implement permissions in your Django generic views playlist. Again, this is the last tutorial in the playlist. If you don't know about the playlist, you can go and check it out. We have discussed everything about Django generic views, from what they are to list views, update views, create view, delete view, everything to authentication to now permissions, right? And please, guys, if you are not subscribed already, please subscribe. These tutorials takes a lot of time and resources and research to get them out. So I plead that you subscribe to at least get this out to other users, get this out to many other Django developers that will like to get this kind of content. So have a nice day, take care of yourself, peace.